As many of you already know, the situation in the Western Balkans during World War II is complicated to say the least. That's why I have put off today's question for a long time, because I knew it would get me embroiled in a hopelessly impossible conflict that nobody with any real sense would want to be a part of. But because I'm an idiot who said I'd answer your questions if you became a patron of mine and donate $5 a month, here is today's question. Hi Tick, there is a big debate here in ex-Yugoslavia about Chetniks. Some people claim that the Chetniks were the royal guard that continued fighting after Yugoslavia capitulated and the king fled, and they did not collaborate with the enemy, while the pro-partisan or Titoist population says they were collaborating. I would like to see a neutral perspective on this, a Westerner's perspective. Also, could you talk more about the Yugoslav resistance, most effective resistance of World War II? Good question, and I like the neutrality of the phrasing. You've given two arguments here asking for a neutral perspective without putting your own view into it. Love it. As someone who has no skin in this game at all, and not in favour of any side, I'm going to try and remain as neutral as possible. But obviously there's a very slim chance of me getting through this video without stepping on someone's toes or saying things that people don't like. So I decided to do what I do best, and that is laying criticism at all sides and unite the Balkans in their hatred of me. And the best way of doing that is announcing my intention to become a citizen of the Free Republic of Libertarian Land, which is a capitalist sovereign state located between Croatia and Serbia, whose language is English and whose country's motto is to live and let live. Perfect. That will definitely unite the Balkans against me. So, let's get on with the history of the Chetniks in World War II. When Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis in 1941, the 700,000-man-strong Yugoslavian army disintegrated within the first week, and unconditional surrender was signed by the Yugoslavian High Command on the 17th of April 1941. But the Germans didn't follow up their success and didn't wipe out the remaining Yugoslavian army elements. Only around 344,000 Yugoslavian troops were captured, the rest fled to the hills and started to form resistance movements. And as this was happening, Yugoslavia was carved up by the Axis. The Germans, the Italians, the Hungarians and the Bulgarians annexed some territory, while three puppet states came into being. Montenegro was an Italian protectorate, while Serbia was a German-controlled puppet regime. And there was the independent state of Croatia, which was the largest state created. Unfortunately though, things weren't as simple as this, and context is needed. On this map, which I got from the never-reliable Wikipedia, it says Croatia was a German and Italian puppet state. This is incorrect. It was created by Italy, but it was German-dominated, and could actually be used as evidence to show why the Germans and Italians weren't exactly cooperating during World War II. But that's another story. German troops occupied the north, while Italian troops occupied the south. However, the Germans dominated the state administration itself and deliberately made it large and encompassing in order to cause tensions between the local populations in the hope that this would divert attention from the occupying powers. You see, the problem is that the Western Balkans has numerous ethnicities, nationalities, religions, and more. Basically, a bunch of different tribes hate each other, but they're all mixed in with each other as well, so drawing lines on a map and saying this area belongs to this tribe is pretty much impossible. And I'm not even going to get into it because it's such a heated topic to say the least. The point is though that this state of Croatia was ruling over a lot of non-Croatians. As but one example, the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina are included in this Croatian state. And this is a problem because the Croatian regime wasn't exactly a nice regime. In fact, the Croatian revolutionary movement, the Ustasha, was in charge, led by Ante Pavlowitch. Now, I can't confirm exactly which ideology they were. A lot of people call them fascists, and they did draw influence from the fascists of Italy and the National Socialists of Germany. However, they also embrace religion, which fundamentally goes against the principles of both fascism and National Socialism. So I'm not exactly sure what these guys are. They may even be a different thing altogether. What I can tell you is that they wanted independence from both the Italian fascist and German National Socialist regimes, and played both the Italians and Germans against each other throughout the war. They also weren't popular, even with Croatians. According to one book I have, the Ustasha movement only had 40,000 followers, which was 6% of the Croatian population. This was partly why they were chosen to lead the Croatian state, because it would destabilize the region and keep everybody weak. Worse, they ruled over something like 2 million non-Croatians. So what they began to do was use terror in order to stay in power, committing atrocities against the civilian population, which even shocked the German SS, as I mentioned in a previous video. 80% of the Croatian Jews would perish either by being hunted by murder militias or in their own concentration camps, but they also persecuted Serbians on a mass scale, as Hale points out. Croatia was the only Axis satellite state that murdered more non-Jewish than Jewish citizens. The Serbian puppet regime was ruled by Milan Nedic. Nedic had been a general in the Yugoslavian army, but didn't believe that the Yugoslavian experiment had been a good idea. He believed that the Germans would now dominate Europe and that the Serbian people would have to fall in line. He was allowed to use the Yugoslavian coat of arms and even the king's portrait, bearing in mind that King Peter was now in London. His overriding mission seems to be to save as many Serbian lives as possible, and he was anti-communist and anti-British. But Nedic's power was limited by his German masters, and he was only allowed an army of 17 to 24,000 men. This caused him issues because other militias and partisan forces were set up within his territory that he had practically no control over. One was Lodic's group, which had up to 12,000 men at its peak and remained outside of Nedic's control, and another was Pechenas, with up to 6,000 Chetniks. But the main Chetnik force was commanded by Colonel Mihailović. Mihailović was a Chetnik who was loyal to the king and the government in exile in London. He was an anti-Axis, anti-communist, pro-monarchy and pro-Serbian. Mihailović had set up a camp in western Serbia, originally with just 7 officers and 27 men. He obviously needed to build up a following, get more money and resources, and establish relations with other groups. And as he was doing all of this, Mihailović wanted to avoid conflict with Axis forces, knowing that if he attacked them or if they attacked him, his force would be wiped out, and there would be reprisals against Serbian civilians. So his strategy was to build up peacefully, protect the civilians where possible, and wait for the opportune moment to strike, which would hopefully be when the Allies landed in the Balkans. And by the autumn of 1941, Mihailović had grown his force to around 4,000 men. But here's the problem. Mihailović has been viewed as the leading Chetnik commander, and that might be true. However, Mihailović didn't have a particularly large force, and that there were numerous other Chetnik leaders with their own forces who were not under Mihailovic's control. At no point did Mihailović gain control over the whole Chetnik movement. So, the Chetnik movement was not a united movement. There was no central command and no coordination of action. As but one example, Mihailović himself tried to form an alliance with Pechenas, but failed to do so because Pechenas had decided to collaborate with the Axis. Each Chetnik group did its own thing. Some of them were outright collaborators with the Axis, others were not. Some even joined the communists. So it's not possible to paint a broad brushstroke and label the whole Chetnik movement as one thing. We have to look at the details. We also have to look at one more group, Tito's communists, sometimes called the Partisans. But I'm not going to call them the Partisans, because they weren't the only partisan movement, and things will get confusing if I did call them that. So, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call them the Communists. Tito, though, is loyal to Moscow. He does not care about anything else other than power and communism. His strategy, therefore, is to attack, attack, attack. From July 1941 onwards, after the start of Operation Barbarossa, and even though they weren't in a great position to do so, Tito's communists started fighting the Axis occupation powers in open revolt. They only had about 2,600 men at this time and a small base of support, but his circumstances and strategy were completely different to Mihailović or the Chetniks. For starters, Tito had taken over arms factories in Yugoslavia and later started receiving arms and supplies from Moscow, which allowed him to actually operate against the Axis. Second, Tito knew that Axis reprisals against civilians would radicalise the civilians and give him more support. Tito knew what all communists and socialists know, that if people are desperate and the economy is destroyed, they will turn to communism and socialism. This is why socialist policies are largely designed to destroy the economy, because if socialism creates mass long-term unemployment, the unemployed will call for socialism. Well, the same applied here. Tito didn't care about the civilians, he wanted them to be persecuted by the Axis, knowing this would enhance his power base, and thus set out on an aggressive anti-Axis strategy, baiting the Axis to retaliate against the civilians. Mihailović and the Chetniks, on the other hand, were looking out for the civilians, and were not getting supplied by Moscow. London gave them some supplies, but only once, and no more supply drops were sent because the British didn't want to sponsor a civil war between the Chetniks and the Communists. This means that the only way the Chetniks could get supplies to mount their anti-Axis resistance was via the Axis powers, the very people they were wanting to get rid of. I mean, this is ridiculous. This placed the Chetniks in a very difficult and awkward position where they had little choice but to cooperate with the Axis in order to get supplies off them, to then build up the supplies they needed to strike against the Axis that they just got the supplies off when the time was right. I mean, just think about that for a second. This is an insane position to be in. Not being supplied from either Moscow or London and wanting to save lives basically forced a strategy of non-aggression and a long-term build-up upon any Chetniks who wanted to resist the Axis. For Mihailović, though, it meant something else. If his goal was to save the civilians and build up forces on the long term, then he had to stop any faction that openly rebelled against the Axis. Open rebellion would hurt the civilians he was trying to save, and would prompt the Axis into striking against the anti-Axis forces, which Mihailovic's meagre supplies would prevent him from resisting, so he had to stop Tito from his open rebellion. At first, Mihailović tried speaking to Tito on the 19th of September 1941, hoping for an alliance or cooperation. A truce was created between them, but nothing else. However, Tito suspected that Mihailović was actually a collaborator who was playing a double game with the Axis forces against him. This was perhaps why the communists surrounded a Chetnik unit on the 21st of September and threw them out of the area they were in. The Germans also mistakenly thought Mihailović was behind the uprisings, not the communists, and thought he was the head of an alliance between the two factions, which he was not. This was why they brought more troops into the area and started murdering civilians, at a time when the truce between Tito and Mihailović broke down. Tito and Mihailović met one last time in late October 1941, but neither could agree with the other's aims. It was the failure of these talks that convinced Mihailović that Tito's communists were his biggest threat. In fact, they were. Mihailović assumed that the Allies would eventually defeat the Axis, which meant that he didn't have to strike against the Axis until the Allies landed in the Balkans. When the Axis were in retreat, Yugoslavian forces would just need to seize power from them. However, there was now two Yugoslavian camps, the monarchists and the communists. So, knowing that the Axis would eventually be defeated, Mihailović realised that his main goal now was to destroy the communists, in order to ensure that they didn't take over Yugoslavia after the war. Mihailović was also contacted by the British, whose stance was that the Chetniks should be fighting for Yugoslavia, not Moscow, and this gave Mihailović the confidence he needed to resist the communists. Knowing that the communists were getting supplied by Moscow, he believed that the communists had to be stopped quickly before they grew in strength, and decided to strike fast. Unfortunately, when they struck in November, Mihailovic's Chetniks were too weak to take out Tito, and it seems they even ran out of ammunition. So, Mihailović went to the puppet regime of Serbia and asked if they could get supplies off the Germans in order to deal with the communists. Negotiations started, and Mihailović offered to leave the Germans alone for a while if the Germans would leave his forces alone to deal with the communists. The Germans, though, refused all offers and demanded unconditional surrender from Mihailović. In the end, Tito defeated Mihailović and, without arms from abroad, forced the Chetnik leader to go underground. In 1942, though, the Germans had suffered defeat on the Eastern Front and now pulled troops out of Croatia. The Italians grasped at the opportunity and started to make plans to increase their influence over the Croatians. So they formed an alliance with Serbian nationalists and started supplying some Chetnik units with arms. These Chetniks then moved into Croatian territory and fought against both Ustasha and communist troops. Confusingly, other Chetnik forces collaborated with the Germans and the Ustasha, with the Germans realising that they needed to rely on Chetnik forces since they had withdrawn troops to fight in the east. But either way, with a lot of Chetniks working with the Axis, Tito was in trouble and his influence waned at this moment. In fact, rebel activity had ceased in Serbia and Montenegro, and it was only in Croatia that any anti-Axis activities occurred at all. The communists were the only real faction at this time putting up open resistance against the Axis. Or so it seemed. In one joint anti-communist operation in October 1942, some of the Chetniks decided to rebel. They seized Ustasha functionaries and killed over 500 Croatian and Muslim civilians. By the end of October, it became clear that the Chetnik intermediaries were making certain promises to the Italians while encouraging the rank and file of the armed formations to do just the opposite. The evidence suggests strongly that in these parts of Yugoslavia, formerly attached to Croatia and occupied successively by Ustasha and Italians, the Chetnik groups were motivated far more by intense hatred for the Croats and Muslims than by anti-partisan sentiments. Mihailović, although primarily interested in destroying Tito's movement as soon as possible, evidently did little to restrain the prevailing mood of national revenge. His own appointees, like Peter Bashević, a former reserve officer and lawyer and then commander of the Chetniks in Herzegovina and eastern Bosnia, openly announced plans to destroy whole Muslim villages. This clearly upset the Axis, who sent complaints to Berlin and Rome about the situation. So, at the end of 1942, the Germans decided to crush the Chetniks, including Mihailovic's movement. Many officers were arrested, and the Germans succeeded in temporarily breaking the Chetnik underground intelligence network. Thus, at this point, the Chetniks were largely confined to Herzegovina and Montenegro, where the Italians needed them to police the areas, now that a lot of Italian troops were withdrawn from Yugoslavia in the wake of the Torch landings and El Alamein. Mihailović had lost contact with many of his Chetnik and Serbian allies who wanted to distance themselves from him so as not to annoy the Germans. Mihailović also fell out of favour with the British since he hadn't done anything of note against the Axis or Tito. To them and others, Chetnik units seemed more interested in fighting ethnic civilian enemies than fighting the Axis or the communists. This in turn hurt their relations with the local populations as well as the Italians, the Croatians, the Germans and the British. However, things changed again in early 1943, with the Germans now suspecting an Allied landing in Greece. They wanted a joint Axis force to clear the Balkans of rebel factions, calling their new plan Operation Weiss. At first, the Germans didn't want the Italians to use Chetnik formations, but the Italians ignored their instructions and continued to give arms and supplies to Mihailović, hoping to use the Chetniks to fight the communists rather than sacrifice their own men against them. But the Chetniks weren't given enough supplies, had to rely on a handful of Italian maps, were only given instructions at the last minute, had no experience at this point fighting with large-scale combined operations, and not all of them were in their starting positions when the operation began on the 20th of January 1943. At this stage, Tito's main force numbered around 25,000 men. The Axis forces had 5 German divisions, 3 Italian divisions, and the 369th Croatian Division, plus Chetnik troops, for a total of around 65,000 men. Tito was also surrounded and decided to give limited resistance to the north of the pocket, whilst breaking out in the south, where the weaker Italian and Chetnik forces were. The Italians decided not to waste their own troops, and so made the Chetniks do the bulk of the fighting. This strategy, though, alienated the Chetniks and caused internal divisions, especially when one Chetnik unit became isolated and the Italians refused to help, letting it get slaughtered by Tito's forces. By early February, Mihailović was under pressure from his own officers to break away from the Italians, which he couldn't do because he needed Italian supplies. He even told the British this on the 28th, angrily stating that their main enemies were Tito and the Communists, the Croatians and the Muslims, whilst their secondary enemies were the Germans and Italians. He also told them that the British had failed to support them properly, forcing them to rely on the Italians. This was all true, but made the British less willing to support the Chetniks. At the same time, the Germans saw the Chetniks as getting in their way, and Hitler, Goering, Ribbentrop and the local German commanders decided to send SS troops in to capture them. As the SS Prince Eugen division moved in for the kill, Tito's remaining 4,000 or so men also began to break out of the pocket in the area where the Chetniks were in. Then, sensing correctly that the Chetniks were weak and poorly equipped, he decided to attack them, driving them back. To make this possible, Tito made a deal with the Germans, asking them to stop attacking him so that he could deal with the Chetniks, which the Germans agreed to do. Tito therefore seized almost all the Chetnik strongholds in Herzegovina, causing the Chetnik troops to lose faith in their cause. The rank and file began to rebel against their officers and recruits started to desert. When the Chetniks called up more men, some refused the call, and a few were executed, which further reduced morale and caused desertions. A lack of money and resources made things worse, and the fact that the Chetniks were working on and off with the Axis persuaded people to throw in their lot with Tito. Then Hitler ordered the invasion of Montenegro under Operation Schwarz. The Italians refused to cooperate, but the Chetniks were in no position to offer effective resistance to the Germans and so quickly collapsed. The Chetnik leadership was paralysed, the organisation was disorganised, and communication seems to have broken down. That said, the Germans only captured a small portion of the Chetniks, with many fleeing to the hills, or were even evacuated by the Italians in some cases. With the Chetnik units disintegrating though, the Italians gave in to the Germans and started to round up the Chetniks they had contact with. In the end, perhaps 6,000 Chetniks survived in the hills, but were now leaderless and low on supplies. This left Mihailović and others little choice but to flee to Serbia. So, by the end of 1943 and early 1944, the Chetnik remnants were largely left in the Serbian puppet state, whilst Tito's communists were causing trouble in the west. Any Chetniks outside Serbia became German auxiliaries after the Italian capitulation and were used against the communists. The Allies and the Soviet Union also met at Tehran and decided to back Tito, who now denounced the London government in exile and announced himself as the legitimate heir to the Yugoslavian state. This also left the Chetniks without any outside support. Mihailović's only hope now was to prevent the communists from moving into the Serbian rump state and try to rebuild his forces. He announced a pro-Chetnik Yugoslav Democratic National Union to attract followers. The problem was that the Chetniks were still pro-monarchy and many saw it as a ruse for military dictatorship. Thus, his plans to rebuild failed. And when the communists tried to cross the Drina River into Serbia, the Chetniks had no choice but to join forces with Nedić and the Germans to stop them. Then Romania fell to the Soviets. It was at this point, the 11th hour, that Hitler ordered von Weichs's Army Group F to collaborate with Mihailović. But it was too little too late and the situation was hopeless. The Soviets were coming in from the east, the Germans were withdrawing north, Tito was coming in from the west, and the Allies gave no hope of support. Thus, Tito overwhelmed the Chetniks in western Serbia and almost captured Mihailović himself, and the Soviets overran the eastern parts of Serbia. The Chetniks split into different groups, with some trying to escape north or south or elsewhere. Unlike the others, who were quickly overwhelmed, Mihailović picked what was probably the best strategy, which was to sit back for a while and then move back into Serbia. However, while he lasted longer than most, his forces were destroyed and he was forced to go underground. In March 1946, he was tried and convicted for high treason, which is ironic because it had been Tito who had renounced the Yugoslavian government in exile. Nonetheless, Mihailović was found guilty and was executed on the 26th of July 1946. So now we've had an overview of the events, we can now attempt to answer the original question. On the one hand, we have the argument that the Chetniks continued fighting for the king and didn't collaborate with the enemy. On the other hand, we have the argument that says the Chetniks collaborated with the Axis. Neither of these arguments, though, are correct. For starters, you cannot judge the whole of the Chetnik movement as a unified entity, because it simply wasn't. Yes, some of the Chetniks did fully collaborate with the Axis, but many also did not. Some even threw in their lot with the communists. So if you say the Chetniks were all collaborators, then you're also saying the communists were collaborators too. Tito made deals with the Axis, but I wouldn't class that as collaboration, just as I wouldn't say that all Chetnik forces collaborated either. Yes, some of the Chetniks did collaborate, but others did not, and those that did collaborate did so for very good reasons. They weren't being supplied by Moscow and had no other means to get supplies except from the Axis. Their priority was to protect civilians, at least Serbian civilians, and they saw the communists as their main enemy, certainly by 1942. Assuming that the Allies would win against the Axis, and knowing that the communist actions were causing the Axis to backlash against civilians, it makes sense why they prioritised the destruction of the communists, and would go so far as to join with the Axis in order to stop them. The enemy of my enemy is my frenemy. But at no point could it be said that the Chetniks were full Axis collaborators. Mihailović's relationship with the Axis was on and off at best. He worked with the Axis 1 minute, but he was fighting against them the next. It's clear that, had he received more supplies from the Western Allies, he wouldn't have worked with the Axis much, if at all. It was the failure of the British to send arms and supplies to him that forced Mihailović down the road he took. And it's clear that, with the benefit of hindsight, that Mihailović was in an almost impossible situation. His long-term strategy of non-aggression against the Axis, waiting for an eventual Allied landing in the Balkans, may have seemed like the best strategy to pursue at the time, but it ultimately made Mihailović look like a ditherer who wasn't really taking action, and meant that Tito's communists both looked like heroes and gained the initiative. Of course, any action he did take would cause the Axis to retaliate against the civilians, which would weaken the Chetniks and strengthen Tito. But he at least would have been active against the Axis. The problem, of course, is that he was acting in faith to his ineffectual government. Mihailović followed the policy laid down by the Yugoslav government in exile on the 22nd of July 1941, when it issued a declaration explaining the impossibility of continuing resistance. It asked the population to bear calmly the hardships of occupation and to believe in an Allied victory which would bring freedom to Yugoslavia. The declaration, which was read over the British Broadcasting Corporation (BBC), admonished the Yugoslavian people to avoid battles and to await the signal from London. Tito, on the other hand, in accordance with Comintern directives, was determined to strike immediately in order to relieve pressure on the Russian front. So, overall, it's a little of column A and a little of column B. A conclusion that's balanced, but will no doubt annoy everyone. Yay. If you want to see what happened to Axis-occupied Greece during the war, YouTube suppressed the video, so you must be logged in and over 18 before you click the link in the description. It may or may not even appear on the screen, depending on how it works. But also, if you want to learn more about why the Nazis recruited non-Germans into the SS, click on this video here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.